We're going to look at a story today about someone some of you may not know, a guy named Barak, and how God used him. But more importantly, at the end, we're going to look at some principles that apply today to you and I, regardless of our age or situation, and how God wants to use you and I, and more importantly, how if we respond correctly, it will cause others to do the same. Welcome to God Powered. Now, today we're going to look at an Old Testament story, but I want you to forget this is Old Testament. See, these stories were put there for our understanding and how God works and to inspire us. And in this story that we'll look at, God's people are facing overwhelming challenges. And frankly, doesn't it seem like so many people you and I know right now are facing the overwhelming? And so we will look at this, and at the end, I will explain why I think this is so relevant to so many people today, and more importantly, that when we respond in the right way, then it inspires others to do the same. And could it be that God is calling you today to be His instrument? So this story is in Judges chapter 4. And it revolves around a man named Barak. Now this is a story and a name some of you may not know. But the Canaanites have been oppressing God's people. And it says they've been oppressing them cruelly. And this has been going on for 20 years. And frankly, the Canaanites are kind of like a superpower at the time. They have 900 iron chariots. And their army, which God will say later, is like a great multitude. Now, one of the consequences we need to recognize when we look at a story like this is, it's so easy to read this quickly. But when people have been oppressed like this for an extended period of time, when they have been under attack, and this is relevant for you and I, for an extended period of time, it's not unusual for their confidence, their boldness to be eroded. It's not unusual, and you see that in people who've been abused, for their esteem to be low enough that they can't even believe they could have the victory. And we'll see a little bit of this in Barak. But again, we need to understand when God's people are facing the overwhelming, that's exactly when God wants to be our champion. He wants to intervene on our behalf. And normally, usually, He wants to do it through His people. And He will do it in a way where He gets glorified. So there's a prophetess named Deborah, and she calls to Barak. And basically what she says is, God has chosen you to be His instrument. And He's going to bring the Canaanite army and their multitude. He's going to lure them to you. Go get 10,000 men from these two tribes. It's very specific. Get 10,000 men from these two tribes. God's going to lure them to you. It's going to be a great multitude, but God is going to give you the victory. Now, I want you to stop for a moment. Imagine in whatever is overwhelming that you see, whether it's in the world, in your church, in your community, in your family. If God said to you, I want you to be my instrument, and I'm going to give you the victory, would you have the boldness? Would you have the confidence to say, okay, great, let's go? Now back to the story. Barak wants to believe, but he needs some assurance. He's feeling a little insecure, frankly. And he responds to Deborah by saying, okay, if you'll go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I'm not going. So it's pretty conditional. Now there's a consequence to this, and we'll see this. Now remember, the Bible is unbelievable in not just accuracy, but how real it is. And we're going to see a little bit of that. And so Deborah says, okay, but because she doesn't say it quite this way, but effectively what she's saying is because you didn't have the trust, the confidence, the boldness to just respond, God will give you the victory, but you're not going to get the credit. The credit will go to a woman. Now, the story goes on. Obviously, Deborah goes with him. They raise the army. It doesn't appear like raising an army is... Now, again, they've been oppressed for 20 years. You would think it would be a challenge, but we don't see that. In fact, we'll see a hint of that in a moment. But we don't see it was a challenge to raise this army of 10,000 men. They go. Now, the Canaanites with their vast multitude, with their iron chariots. I mean, again, the reality of what Barak is facing is right there. And again, talk about the fact, how can we win? But what happens? The Lord sowed confusion among the Canaanites. Now, we want a battle that's boom. God snaps his finger and it's won. But what we see so often is, as we'll see here in just one moment, it requires our continual pressing to get that victory. So God sowed confusion among the Canaanites. And what happens? God's people, fighting hard, start to get the victory. And in the confusion, the king of the Canaanites, their commander, runs away. Now, he winds up going to this woman. He's exhausted, asking for something to drink. She gives it to him. And long story short, but this is the reality of the Bible, how seriously real it is. In his exhaustion, he falls asleep. She takes a tent peg and hammers it through his head and kills him. Sorry, a little graphic, but that's how real the Bible is. And God's people have gotten a victory. But there's several things I want us to recognize. Number one, the very end of chapter 4, it says that the people continued pressing. In other words, they fought determinedly. They continued to fight, and God gave them victory. In other words, we see these stories, and yes, God sowed confusion. God was at work, but God's people had to continue the pressure. They had to continue in faith, in boldness, doing what He gave them to do. And their continued faithfulness, their continued pressure brought the victory. Now, on top of that, there's something really important for you and I to recognize. So God works through His people. And if you get a moment, take a look, read the story, but then continue on into chapter 5 is where Barak and Deborah, they write a poem, a song basically, to commemorate what God has done. But it says something very interesting in verse 2. It says, when leaders lead, the people follow willingly. See, God is looking for men and women of faith, those new generation heroes of the faith that He can use in every circumstance. And our battle is not physical, but we're in a battle nonetheless. And we have to continue pressing. We have to continue in faithfulness. But God is looking for those that will respond in boldness and say, okay, here I am, use me. And when you and I do, what happens? When leaders will lead, the people will follow willingly. When you and I, even though it may look lonely, it may look like we're the only ones, when we will respond and say, okay, Lord, here I am, use me. What happens? God's at work. God will bring the people. The people will follow willingly. God will bring the victory, but we must continue to press in faithfulness in all that He has for us to do. And in doing so, we will get the complete victory and He gets glorified.